Good morning. It is Friday, the 19th of December. I'm Maeve McMahon, and this is Europe Today, Euronews's daily live fix of European news and analysis. Coming up today, after 16 hours of talks, an EU summit in Brussels has come to a dramatic end in the early hours of this rainy December morning. The big takeaways: a €90 billion cheque for Ukraine, raised with joint debt though, not with Russian money, and a postponement of the EU-Mercosur trade deal. For more on the twists and turns of the long night and the winners and losers around the summit table, I'm joined here in our studio by our EU News editor, Maria Today, who actually has not slept a wink. Good morning, Maria.
Not a wink.
But you are as fresh as ever. So great to have you with us. Look, bring us up to speed on what exactly happened last night. The reparations loan seems to be over. They agreed on joint debt. They could have done that weeks ago.
Well, they could have, and obviously that would have saved us the all-nighter. In a way, this was very much on brand because, remember, European leaders walking in the morning, they said, we're not leaving this place. We are not going to leave until there is a solution in terms of how to fund Ukraine from 2026 and 2027. And that has happened, and it's been done. 90 billion euros in an interest-free loan for the country, but the night did not go as planned because the reparations loan, that did not happen. It's very difficult to see how this reparation loan can even go ahead in the weeks, months to come. In many ways, it is over. The road has ended. And nonetheless, the European leaders have agreed, though, to tap financial markets to raise the 90 billion euros, provide this loan, and that's the way this is going to go. And I should note one thing, Maeve. Yesterday night at about 11:30, I got a call from a source who told me, you are not going to believe this, but the Hungarians, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia are now meeting, and they are pitching and putting forward this plan for joint debt. They will not participate, but it looks like this is the way it's going to go, and ultimately landed like this. They cite what they call as an enhanced cooperation clause, which means that they will not participate, but the others will go to the market and they will fund and get this loan for Ukraine.
What a twist and turn indeed there. And of course, the Germans had to cave in. I mean, not a good night for Friedrich Merz. He came across very bruised to the German Chancellor.
Look, it was not a good night for the German Chancellor because, remember, he had lobbied so hard and so passionately for this reparations loan because beyond the funding, there was, of course, a question of the optics and the politics. And the politics of it was Russia's created a mess. They've created all this damage in Ukraine. They should pay it. You break it, you pay it. Why should the European taxpayer do it? Well, ultimately, in a way, this reparations loan is not going to happen. And the German Chancellor comes out of this also weakened because the Mercosur was also not signed yesterday night. This was a big plan, and none of the big options the Germans put on the table actually manifested in any way.
So that's perhaps the loser of the night. And what about the winners? Who were the winners of this EU summit?
Look, the winners clearly is the Ukrainian president because he wanted the money. He needed the money. He was very clear about that. And now he's got the 90 billion euros that he needs 2 years to fund his military and the budget. And of course, we talk about this loan, but we've got to be very honest, Maeve. The chances that Ukraine will pay this back are minimal. Then we've got to talk about the Belgian Prime Minister. He said, look, there's a lot of risks. I do not like this idea of a reparations loan. At some point in the night, he talked about unlimited support and unlimited guarantees, and that created a lot of nervousness around the other leaders. So in a way, he also called the bluff. You know, the idea of support in Belgium clearly had limits. And then we've got to go to Orban. You know, he said this reparations loan is a bad idea. He's negotiated something differently. He managed to insert himself in the conversation. And then by the end of the summit, he said, look, the European leaders, the rest of them, they can do what we want, but Hungary is not going to pay a cent in this. And again, through this clause of the enhancement cooperation, they will get the money, but Hungary will not participate. The Czechs, nonetheless, they will not participate either. And the same applies to Slovakia. So again, the limelight for Viktor Orban. And he repeated, we said this reparations loan was not going to happen. And ultimately, it did not happen.
And just briefly, is it enough money? The IMF said it's probably not.
Look, that's a very good question because when you look at Ukraine clearly, and the IMF has been clear about this, this is a country that has debt sustainability problems because the economy has been wrecked as a result of the war. What they argue is that loans will not be enough. Ukraine needs grants. And that means, going back to today, the 90 billion euros, it's very unlikely we'll ever see Ukraine paying it back because the argument is that Russia would then pay them for the damage and then they will repay the loan. But again, Maeve, do we really believe belief that Russia will pay damages. I think yesterday and tonight that shows that is very, very difficult. And Russia, for the time being, is not going to pay a cent.
Indeed, Maria, today our EU News editor. Let's just take a listen to some of those leaders. We can bring in Bart de Wever, the Belgian Prime Minister, the protagonist, if you like, of the last couple of weeks, and also Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister.
Supporting Ukraine is not charity. It is the most important investment we can make in our own security. There was never any debate about whether we would help. The only real question was how. Had we left Brussels divided today, Europe would have walked away from geopolitical relevance. It would have been a total disaster.
Hungary is totally out of that. I think it's a bad decision. And those who are behind that loan will take the responsibility and the financial consequences of that. 3 countries decided not to be part of it. That's an opt-out for Czech Republic, Slovakia and Hungary. So we are innocent.
So a glimpse there of Viktor Orban and, of course, Bart de Wever, heads of state that are now hopefully getting some rest. And Maria today, of course, hopefully getting some rest too after that analysis. And as you heard from Maria today, Ukraine's President Zelensky was also physically here in Brussels for this EU summit to warn EU leaders there are much, quote, greater threats than lawsuits. President Zelensky also spent hours locked in talks with the Belgian Prime Minister Bart de Wever. For more on President Zelensky's reaction to this December summit and the fact that EU leaders went with Plan B to fund Ukraine, we're joined here on set by our Ukraine correspondent. That is, of course, Sasha Vakalina. Good morning, Sasha.
Morning.
Great to have you with us. Look, how has the reaction been from Kyiv on this loan, this Plan B?
Well, President Zelensky thanked the leaders for this decision because ultimately, as Maria just said, Ukraine did get the money and Ukraine can continue because the first injection of financial aid was expected to be as early as April next year. And Zelensky spoke in details yesterday here at the summit about the fact that what will happen and how damaging it's going to be if Ukraine does not get any financing. So yes, ultimately, this is indeed a good decision and a good result of the summit for Ukraine. He also said it is very important that Russian assets remain immobilized. This is a matter of principle for the Ukrainian side. Of course, they are defending itself. They're not the country, not the side that started the aggression, the all-out war. This is why they do believe that, in terms of just peace, and that's, of course, the terms that we have been hearing from Ukraine and from the European Union, it is important to keep those assets immobilized. But at the same time, there was something else that Zelensky had on his agenda. That was, of course, the security guarantees and how to continue. Because financing is one thing, it is good to have, but the war rages on. Russia continues raging that war on. And yesterday, right after his meeting, after he addressed the Council, I asked him whether those legally binding commitments from the European leaders that we have heard about on Monday in the meeting in Berlin, can they actually somehow replace NATO accession for the country, and whether the US security guarantees and the European guarantees are the same thing. This is what he had to say.
We do not believe that Europe should replace the United States of America. And of course, we feel the same way about the security guarantees from the US, which will be Article 5-like, and we will not need European support. These are different things. And no matter what signals Russia sends, we understand that they would like to exclude the presence of Europeans. This cannot be done. These are different things. This does not mean that if Russia attacks again, Europe will be able to fight with its presence. No, no one is saying that. Europe's presence reduces the chances of aggression by the Russian Federation.
President Zelensky there answering your question, Sasha Vakalina, yesterday in that EU summit. And just beyond the politics of the EU summit, there's other developments going on. We're hearing about potential talks this weekend between the Americans, the Ukrainians and the Russians.
Indeed, these would be 2 different bilateral meetings, 2 tracks, the American delegation with the Ukrainian delegation, and Zelensky did confirm that the Ukrainian negotiators are in the US today and tomorrow, and then separately Ukrainian delegation with the Russian representatives. And President Trump spoke about it, and he said the time is ticking, except he said it's ticking for Ukraine, Maeve.
It's ticking for Ukraine. Well, Sasha Vakalina, thank you so much for all those updates. And for more of Sasha's reporting, you can visit Euronews.com. But as you heard earlier, there is another huge headline from this very long EU summit in Brussels. It's perhaps about the concerns of the farmers that the EU-Mercosur trade deal has been postponed. Farmers from all across Europe gathered in Brussels for a very long, noisy demo, but less violent perhaps than farmer protests that we've seen in the past. And while the farmers were out in the streets of the EU capital, representatives of the main farmers association, that's Copa Cochega, actually had a sit-down meeting with the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and also the EU Council President Antonio Costa. And during the summit, our Europe Today's Ida Sanchez actually had the opportunity to go and visit and speak to those farmers and take a listen to their concerns. You can take a look.
What we want is to be able to live off our work. We are against Mercosur because it is not right to import meat and products from foreign countries that do not comply with the same standards as we do. We have a lot of standards to comply with, and I cannot accept the idea that we will end up importing their products which are not subject to the same rules.
Aucune norme.
And that was one farmer that came all the way from Bourgogne in France. And for more on what looks like a pretty big failure for Brussels having to postpone this big historic deal, let's go straight now over to the EU Council and bring in Euronews correspondent, that's Shona Murray, who hasn't slept all night either and is actually, Shona, in the very same outfit that you were wearing this time yesterday here on Europe Today. So thank you so much for being with us here, Shona, on the show. Look, tell us, is this a big failure, the fact that it had to be postponed? We know Ursula von der Leyen, she was actually meant to get on a plane today or tomorrow to actually travel to Brazil to sign this deal. And now it's all postponed.
That's right, Maeve. Well, it'll be a big failure if they don't sign the deal in January, because that's how long it's postponed for. And remember, the EU is really trying to reaffirm its position as a giant, really, of trade all across the globe. So Mercosur is a really strong part of that, notwithstanding the concerns that the farmers obviously have. So what happened was Mercosur was supposed to have a vote. There was supposed to be a vote on it by member states this week, potentially on Wednesday, then even possibly today. But at the behest of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, that has been postponed for 3 weeks. Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, was supposed to travel to Brazil tomorrow to sign off on that deal. That deal has been in negotiation for 26 years. And the EU said last night, OK, you know, what's another 3 weeks? But actually, it doesn't look great, because remember, there's no guarantees that the Italians will definitely sign up to that. The reason why there was a postponement is because Giorgia Meloni said she wanted more time to talk to Italian farmers about some of the safeguard clauses that were agreed with the European Parliament on Wednesday, which was supposed to really support the EU's agricultural industry. So we're not too sure if they're definitely going to support that. So there could be a failure, but right now the EU is saying, hold tight, we'll get this across the line. Maeve?
Well, certainly it was Giorgia Meloni who held the keys, of course, to this deal. Shona, I guess all our viewers are wondering what happens next. Could a delay actually be the final nail in the coffin for Mercosur?
Well, look, I think that what we've been discussing all week really around Mercosur is the numbers. Obviously, Italy is one of the bigger member states. It's obviously a heavily agricultural state. So its deciding vote on qualified majority is really substantial. But then you have other countries like Germany, for example, who've been really pushing Mercosur. And we heard earlier from Maria Tadeo saying this summit wasn't great for Germany. They're quite annoyed at this postponement, although Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, was trying to bat that away and say, no, we'll get a deal done in January. And some German sources I've spoken to have said that. And as I mentioned, this Mercosur deal, as big as it is actually even bigger than the sum of its parts, because the EU has had to see itself shift away from its traditional alliance of trade with the United States because of the tariff wars and move into other areas of the world, other 83% of the world. And Mercosur is really a key part of that. If they fail after 26 years of negotiations, who will want to do a deal, a trade deal with Europe? And remember, Europe really prides itself on being a reliable partner. How reliable can you be if you can't even get a vote across the line? And the President of the European Commission can't even make it to Brazil to meet with President Lula to sign off on that agreement. Maeve?
Shona Marie, thank you so much for that live update from the EU summit, and also to all the Euronews team of reporters who are up all night reporting for our live blog. Do visit euronews.com to read more about what all these decisions taken at the EU summit mean for you. But that brings this edition of Europe Today to an end, our special summit edition. Thank you so much for joining us. Take care, and we'll see you very soon on Euronews.